It happened on a Tuesday. The kind of ordinary day that doesn't hint at disaster. I had just come home from another 12-hour shift, my shirt still smelling like metal and engine grease. She was curled up on the couch, eyes locked on a streaming show she had probably binged all day, a glass of wine in one hand, the remote in the other. I stood there for a second before speaking. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I already knew how it would be received. I can't afford this anymore, I said, my voice flat. Not angry, not defeated, just honest. She didn't look up right away. Just sipped her wine, paused the show, then turned her head toward me like I had interrupted a minor inconvenience. Stop being dramatic, she said. No sarcasm, no bite, just complete dismissal, like my words were background noise, like I was the problem for feeling the weight of a house we couldn't afford, of debt we never discussed, of her expenses that piled up while I quietly calculated how many months of overtime I had left in me. That's when I knew. Not that we were in trouble, I'd known that for years. Not even that she didn't love me anymore, that had been fading since the second renovation. No, what I realized in that moment was far colder. She had stopped seeing me entirely. I was a fixture, a paycheck, a man-shaped ATM with a rusting soul and reliable routines. I said nothing else that night. I walked to our bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, shoes still on. I listened to her laughter from the living room as the next episode started. I thought about the credit card bills under my name that she never asked about. The new handbag that had shown up the week before, the girl trips she took every 2 months that left my weekends eerily silent. The truth was, I'd been subsidizing her fantasy life while quietly erasing pieces of my own, and I had let it happen. I had allowed the trade, my time, my health, my peace for a relationship that had become transactional. But that night, something shifted. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't demand an apology. I started listening, watching, collecting data the way I would when troubleshooting a failing system at work. What expenses were automated? What accounts were joint? Which conversations she avoided? I didn't tell her I was struggling. I had already told her, and she had laughed it off. Now, I would stop speaking entirely and start planning. There's a difference between silence born of defeat and silence born of strategy. Mine was the latter. I began documenting everything. Quietly pulling bank statements, reviewing email receipts, noting times. I installed a private budgeting app and mapped every outgoing dollar. I made backup copies of our financial records and stashed them in a folder labeled Home Repairs. And as I watched her scroll through her curated life, smiling at filtered moments and approval from strangers, I felt something rare. Clarity, not anger, not grief, just precision. She thought I was being dramatic. She had no idea that I had just begun the most important performance of my life. I started with the small things, receipts, transactions. Her spending had a rhythm one I hadn't noticed before. Not because I was blind, but because I had chosen not to look too closely. There's a kind of self-deception that happens in long relationships. You assume patterns are just habits, not signals. But when I began tracking them, they spoke volumes. Every second Friday, a $312 charge from a boutique I had never stepped foot in. Monthly payments to a personal trainer I had never met. A luxury skincare subscription that cost more than our electricity bill, and the vacations, the vacations. Branded as girls' getaways, but booked with a precision that felt less spontaneous and more choreographed. I checked our calendar, compared dates. Her claimed work conference in Miami overlapped perfectly with a 5-star hotel charge under a different name. It wasn't just the money. It was the deception packaged in casual shrugs and vague explanations. The same woman who mocked my concerns couldn't be bothered to hide the truth. Well, she didn't need to. She didn't think I was looking, but I created a spreadsheet. Coded columns, matched charges with her statements. What began as simple curiosity became confirmation. She was siphoning our resources to fund a separate life, not just financially, emotionally. The private number that always called around 10 p.m. when she thought I was asleep, the way she laughed differently when texting late, lighter, freer, like the version of herself she used to be with me, had moved on without me. I didn't confront her. That's not how this would work. Instead, I dug deeper. I found the second credit card she had applied for without my knowledge. I traced it to an online account using an old email she once mentioned in passing. The password reset was simple. She still used our wedding date. Irony, I suppose. Inside was everything I needed. Flights, hotel bookings, gift purchases. One charge stood out. Dinner for 2 at a rooftop restaurant in Chicago, $482. 4 days before our anniversary. I remembered that night she said she was visiting her sister. She even sent a picture of them together. Now I saw the metadata. It was a screenshot from last year. She had staged it. It's a strange kind of heartbreak to realize you've been replaced not by someone else, but by an illusion. She wasn't living a double life. She was living one life, and I was just the financier. Still, I said nothing. I needed her comfortable. Predictable. If I moved too soon, she'd shift. I needed the full picture, so I watched. I learned. I became the silent observer in my own marriage. She once accused me of being too passive, said I lacked initiative. What she didn't know was that I was documenting her erosion of trust with forensic precision. And then something changed, something small, but important. She came home one night, smiling. She kissed me on the cheek like she used to, poured herself a drink, and said, "I've been thinking we should maybe get separate accounts. Just to make things cleaner." Cleaner. I nodded, said it made sense. That I appreciated her foresight. What I didn't say was that I had already opened my own account 3 weeks earlier, moved half of our joint savings into it under the guise of emergency planning. She hadn't noticed. Her request wasn't about organization. It was about isolation. Financial independence meant detachment. It meant she was ready to leave, or at least preparing to. And like always, she expected I'd agree, adapt, accommodate. That night, I added a new tab to my spreadsheet. Phase 2. Because if she was planning her exit, I would make sure she walked into a net of her own making. Before I could move forward, I needed to look back. You can't understand someone's betrayal without first understanding the foundation they walked on to get there on. In our case, that foundation had cracks from the beginning. We met during a low point in my life. I had just lost my father, and the weight of unfinished conversations and unresolved resentment made me easy to impress and easier to manipulate. She came into my life like a gust of fresh wind, full of energy, charm, ambition. She asked questions no one else had asked, listened like she meant it, or maybe I just needed someone to seem like they did. Our relationship progressed fast. Within a year, we were engaged. By the second year, we had a mortgage. People told me we were moving quickly, but I mistook their concern for envy. I didn't see that her ambition wasn't about building with MIT, was about climbing. Through me. In those early years, the red flags were small. A story that changed slightly every time she told it. Friendships she discarded the moment they no longer served her. Jokes that cut deeper than they should have, always brushed off as just teasing. But I was too busy being grateful to be noticed. Too busy surviving to question the terms of my own comfort. Now, years later, those moments echoed louder. I found an old photo album she had put away in a drawer, something we hadn't touched. Since moving into this house, inside were images of us smiling, arms around each other, holding keys, standing on freshly painted porch steps. But the captions she had written in the margins caught my attention. First house, his money, my vision. Made him believe it was his idea. Phrases that at the time felt playful now read like notes in a playbook. Reminders of her strategy. Proof that the performance had been running long before I noticed the stage. I reached out to people we hadn't spoken to in years. Her old roommate, a mutual friend who had faded from our lives quietly. I asked careful questions, listened more than I spoke. Patterns emerged, stories of control, selective truth, calculated exits. She didn't burn bridges. She just crossed them and never looked back. One conversation stayed with me. Her former friend, a woman named Leela, told me something chilling. She always knew how to tailor herself to what people needed. She didn't lie, not exactly. She gave you the version of the truth that would keep you closest, until you weren't useful anymore. Useful, it wasn't the word that hurt. It was how accurately it explained the last 3 years of my life. That night, I went back through our wedding video. Her vows had always made people cry eloquent, romantic, rehearsed, but now I watched them with new eyes. She never said the word honor, never promised partnership, only support your dreams and build a life of abundance. At the time, I thought she meant us. Now I wondered if she only meant herself. But this wasn't about pain anymore. Pain had already served its purpose. This was about leverage. By tracing her patterns, I had found the most dangerous piece of information. She wasn't just careless, she was consistent, and consistent people are predictable, which meant I could plan not just for what she had done, but for what she was likely to do next. I began drafting a letter. Not to her, not yet. To a lawyer. One I had been referred to by a coworker going through a brutal divorce. I kept the tone factual. No emotion, just dates, data, documentation. I wasn't interested in revenge. I was interested in facts. And the facts were finally in my favor. She had played a long game. Now it was my turn. I had always believed in solving problems quietly. At work, I was the guy people called when things got messy, not because I shouted the loudest, but because I understood systems, patterns, weak points. I approached this the same way I would troubleshoot a machine. Identify the failure, isolate the cause, design the solution. The lawyer I contacted, Marlo, was methodical, sharp, and disturbingly calm. She didn't flinch when I laid out the details. She simply asked for documentation, and I gave her everything. Emails, bank statements, screenshots, audio recordings. I had compiled over 200 pages of evidence. My marriage, reduced to data points and digital trails. Her analysis was swift, infidelity, financial misconduct, and a pattern of deceit. In the eyes of the court, it was enough to tilt the scales. But the strength of my case wasn't just in the facts, it was in the preparation. Every move I had made was legal. Every dollar traceable. Every withdrawal accounted for. She couldn't argue chaos because I had turned our life into a ledger. Still, I wasn't naive. People like her don't unravel easily. They spin, redirect, victimize. I couldn't just file papers and expect the world to realign. I needed control, not just legally, but psychologically. I had to manage her reaction as carefully as I had built my case. So, I staged normalcy. I suggested we go out more, rekindle some US time. I cooked dinners, asked about her day, played the part she thought I had forgotten, and she responded, smiling more, leaning in, testing whether I had softened. It wasn't affectionate, was reconnaissance. She was assessing the temperature, trying to predict when to jump ship, but I had already drained the harbor. Behind the scenes, I moved quickly. I revised my will, changed my emergency contacts, closed a dormant savings account, and redirected the balance into a trust under my sister's name. I updated passwords, revoked her access from certain platforms, all under the radar. All legal. And then came the prenup, the clause she had forgotten about. When we married, she had insisted on one. Said it was just a formality, a sign of maturity. Back then, I had agreed without resistance. I didn't care about the fine print. I just wanted her. But Marla read the fine print, and what it said was clear. In cases of proven infidelity, she forfeited all claims to spousal support and shared assets acquired after year 5. We were in year 7. The apartment downtown. The joint account, the SUV, all mine, under the clause. If the court ruled in my favor, she'd leave with what she brought into the marriage, a box of books and a designer handbag. I scheduled the meeting carefully. A Thursday afternoon, after she'd returned from one of her work retreats. I made coffee. Sat her down. She looked tired but guarded. I slid the envelope across the table and said, calmly, "You'll want to read this." She laughed at first, scoffed, accused me of overreacting. I said nothing, just waited. As she read, her face shifted. Not fear, calculation. She was searching for an angle, a loophole, a way to spin the moment. But the blueprint was complete. Every piece locked in place, no emotion, just facts. And in the silence that followed, she realized it too. "This isn't like you," she said, finally. "You don't make moves like this." "No," I replied. "I used to think I didn't have to." There was no shouting, no plates thrown, just an understanding that the script had flipped. She had built a life on the assumption that I would never act, that I would absorb, adapt, endure. But I had designed a different ending, and this was only the beginning of it. She didn't leave. That night, she stayed, not out of love, not out of confusion, but because she was recalibrating. I saw it in her eyes. Not regret, not fear. Strategy. She thought there might still be a way to control the outcome, to pivot. People like her rarely panic. They adjust. The next few days were tense, but quiet. She cooked dinner twice, which was new, asked me about my day, watched me more closely, like I was a stranger moving through her familiar space, and in a way, I was the version of me she had constructed. The passive, forgiving man who worked late and didn't ask questions had disappeared, and the version she was now looking at didn't blink when she smiled for too long, or flinch when she left the room to take a call. She was waiting for a signal, for me to backpedal, to soften. Instead, I followed through. Marla filed the petition. Certified mail, timestamped. She'd be officially served within 72 hours. In the meantime, I moved out, not emotionally, but logistically. I took only what was mine. Tools, documents, a few boxes of clothes. I left behind the decorative shell she had filled, the curated home designed for display, not comfort. And I stayed with a friend, someone who had watched me fade over the last few years without knowing how to help. He didn't ask questions, just handed me a key. When the papers arrived, she called me. Not to scream, not to cry, but to negotiate. "This doesn't have to be ugly," she said. No, I agreed. It doesn't. But what she meant was something else entirely. What she wanted was leverage, something to reclaim control. She floated offers, mentioned mediation, hinted at the damage we could both avoid, but I had already stepped beyond that line. I wasn't interested in preserving a lie. I was interested in truth, clean, documented. Final. She responded by shifting tactics. I came home one afternoon to pick up a document I had left behind and found her in the kitchen, with a man I didn't recognize. A financial advisor, she claimed. He was tall, smug, dressed like a billboard for subtle intimidation. She introduced him with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "He's just helping me understand a few things," she said. I nodded, shook his hand, and left without comment. Let her show her cards. Let her believe she was still dealing from a full deck. The next day, Marla informed me that my wife had attempted to freeze one of our joint accounts, a temporary hold, citing domestic instability, but she had done it too late. The balance was already moved, legally logged. Her request was denied. The unraveling had begun, not loud, but incremental. Her financial advisor disappeared. Her sister called me, confused and concerned, asking what was really going on. And one by one, the people she had cultivated as allies began to see through the performance. Because people like her don't just burn trust in a marriage, they erode it everywhere. Slowly, until all that's left is charm with no credibility. Then came the final shift. The smear attempt posts appeared online, vague, but targeted, suggestions that I had been distant, unavailable, controlling in subtle ways. Carefully worded, just abstract enough to avoid liability. But people talk. Screenshots circulate, and even the curated persona she had spent years crafting began to crack under scrutiny. I said nothing. Let the silence work for me, because I wasn't defending myself anymore. I was watching a structure collapse one brick at a time, and when the dust settled, all that would remain was the truth she never thought anyone would see. Courtrooms are colder than they appear on television, not in temperature, but in atmosphere, procedural, indifferent to drama. It's a theater where emotion is stripped to its legal core. And that suited me just fine. We sat on opposite sides, no longer husband and wife, but opposing parties. She wore a tailored navy suit, understated makeup, a face sculpted to project restraint. I knew the look well. It was the same one she used to wear to job interviews she never wanted. Calculated calm, her voice leak, rehearsed argued, unfair pressure, emotional absence, and a breakdown of partnership. They leaned on ambiguity, on soft language meant to suggest fault without proving it. She looked down, often, occasionally dabbing at her eyes with a tissue she had barely touched. It was a performance curated for maximum sympathy, but facts don't blink. Marla began with the financials. Every dollar, every lie, every transaction tied to a date, a name, a destination. Then came the timeline of infidelity receipts, reservations, the secondary credit card she had attempted to hide. We played audio, reviewed messages. Every item was calm, factual, devastating. There was no need for anger. The truth, laid out systematically, did the damage on its own. I didn't watch her while it unfolded. I focused on the judge, on the process, on staying composed. This wasn't revenge, it was resolution. Her reactions, flashes of confusion, indignation, disbelief, no longer moved me, because this wasn't about her anymore. This was about the version of myself I had buried to keep the illusion alive, and now, he was resurfacing. Her lawyer tried to pivot, accused me of withholding communication, of emotional retreat, but Marla was ready. We presented a timeline of reconciliation attempts, therapy sessions she missed, emails I sent, messages she ignored. The pattern was clear. She hadn't been abandoned. She had simply moved on while I was still standing in place, holding the weight of 2 lives. Then came the prenup. She hadn't expected us to enforce it. Maybe she thought it was a bluff, or that guilt would steer me away from the fine print. But there it was, notarized, airtight, and with the court's acknowledgement of her infidelity, the clause activated. No spousal support. No claim to assets acquired past year 5. The apartment, the accounts, the car legally, entirely mine. She broke the knot publicly, not with tears or shouting, but with a silent drop of her shoulders. A tiny inhale, a pause that lasted just long enough to register. The realization had landed. For years, she had authored the story, controlled the tone, and now, for the first time, she was reading a chapter she hadn't written. The judge's ruling was swift. Divorce granted, assets awarded per agreement. No appeal granted on financial terms. Custody not applicable. There were no children, no complications, just finality. We exited the courtroom separately. She didn't look back. Outside, the air felt different. Not lighter, just real. I had imagined this moment in so many forms, as triumph, as catharsis, even as emptiness. But what I felt was simpler, peace. Not because I had won, but because I had chosen truth over endurance. And built my exit with the same quiet care I had once used to build a future with her. It's been 6 months since the ruling. The apartment is quieter now, not in a hollow way, but in a deliberate one. The kind of silence that lets you hear your own thoughts without having to defend them. I still wake early. I still make coffee the same way, but I sit a little longer at the table. Let the stillness hold me instead of rushing to outrun it. People asked if I was planning to date again. I told them no, not yet. Maybe not for a long time. When you survive a relationship that feeds on your silence, your first instinct isn't to speak again, it's to relearn the sound of your own voice. And mine had been buried for years. I kept the apartment, not out of sentimentality, but because I needed a reminder, not of her, but of me. The man who once paid every bill, ignored every instinct, rationalized every red flag. The man who once equated sacrifice with love and endurance with virtue. He still lives here, but now he's learning boundaries. Discipline, distance. The furniture's different. I sold the designer pieces she insisted we needed, replaced them with simpler things. Clean lines, no ornamentation. I painted the living room myself. Didn't hire anyone. Took 3 weekends, 2 buckets of paint, and a playlist I hadn't listened to since we first moved in. It felt like reclaiming something invisible. She reached out once. A text, just one sentence. "I hope you're okay." I didn't respond. Not because I hate her. I don't, but because answering would have reopened a door I spent too long learning how to close. Forgiveness doesn't always require contact. Sometimes it just means refusing to carry someone else's weight a step further. Marla and I still speak, not often, but sometimes. She asked if I ever felt like I overplanned it, if I regretted not confronting my wife earlier. I told her no, because confrontation without clarity is just noise. I didn't need noise, I needed precision, and when the time came, I delivered it with clean hands. The money's stable, the accounts are secure, the debts are cleared. I live beneath my means, now not out of fear, but out of choice. Because survival taught me something success never could. Freedom isn't found in accumulation, it's found in awareness, in knowing where you stand, in refusing to pretend that betrayal is anything but what it is. Sometimes I still wonder what she tells people about what happened. Maybe that I snapped, that I was cold, that I stopped loving her one day without warning, and maybe that's fine. Let her have the version that protects her ego. I don't need to correct the record anymore. The truth has no expiration date, and it doesn't need an audience to remain real. There are nights I revisit the documents, not to reopen wounds, but to remind myself what vigilance looks like, what quiet courage feels like. There's a power in seeing how far you let someone walk through your life and how decisively you close the door behind them. I don't see myself as a victim. I see myself as a man who finally listened to the voice he had spent years silencing, a man who chose clarity over comfort. And in doing so, found something rarer than love, self-respect. It doesn't keep you warm at night, but it lets you sleep. And that, I've learned, is worth everything.